I want to start with a date. September 1st, 1859. That's the date they give you. The date the sky turned red over North America, over Europe, over Australia. The date telegraph operators reported their equipment sparking and firing without any power source. The date that auroras, those ghostly ribbons of light typically confined to the Arctic Circle, were spotted over Cuba, over the Bahamas, over the mountains of Colombia and the flatlands of Queensland. The official explanation is elegant, almost suspiciously so. A British astronomer named Richard Carrington was observing the sun through a telescope at his private observatory in Red Hill, Surrey. He witnessed, he claims, a blinding white flash erupting from the solar surface, a coronal mass ejection of unprecedented scale. Charged particles, billions of tons of magnetized plasma, hurtling toward Earth at millions of miles per hour. They arrived in approximately 17 hours. They struck Earth's magnetosphere. The magnetosphere, in turn, induced electrical currents in every conductive material on the planet's surface. That's the story. It's clean. It's scientific. It's been repeated in textbooks since roughly the turn of the 20th century. But the deeper I looked, and I mean really looked, past the textbook summaries and the Wikipedia entries, and the reassuring diagrams of solar wind, the more a different picture began to emerge. Because here's the thing about the official explanation. It explains the lights in the sky beautifully. It explains the disrupted telegraph lines. It gives us a mechanism, a cause, a reassuring framework from the world of physics. What it doesn't explain, what it can't explain, and what nobody seems to want to talk about is everything else that was happening on the ground in 1859. What emerged is not a picture of a random natural event absorbed by a primitive technological world, but a picture of a world that was, in some ways, far less primitive than we've been taught to believe. A world with energy infrastructure built into its very architecture. A world that may have been running on something we don't have a name for anymore. And a world that, after September 1859, started systematically removing the evidence. What if the sun was just the cover story? Let's start with what we know, or rather let's start with what we're told we know. The Carrington Event is described even today as the largest geomagnetic storm in recorded history. Carrington himself, a wealthy English amateur, was sketching sunspots through his telescope when he observed a brilliant white flash. Less than 18 hours later, the storm arrived. Telegraph systems across Europe and North America failed simultaneously. Some caught fire. Some reportedly continued to operate even after operators disconnected the batteries, drawing current directly from the charged atmosphere itself. That last detail. Hold on to that detail. Because here's the question no one seems to ask. Why were the telegraphs the only systems that responded to this surge of atmospheric energy? Think about that for a moment. We're told the atmosphere was so electrically charged that metal wires strung between poles, copper lines, rudimentary insulation, simple circuits, were not only disrupted but were powered, energized by the geomagnetic event to the point of autonomous function. And yet, look at the rooftops of virtually every major city on Earth in the mid-19th century. Look at what was up there. Metal rods, spires, ornate copper-tipped lightning conductors, elaborate finials on public buildings, on churches, on train stations, on grand hotels, on government buildings, on academic institutions. These structures were everywhere. They were identical in their basic configuration across cities that had no reason to coordinate their architectural choices. Paris, London, St. Petersburg, New York, Chicago, Buenos Aires, Bombay, Shanghai. The same motif, the same vertical metal element, the same connection to the sky. This raises a simple but critical question. What exactly were all those rods and spires for? The official answer is lightning protection. Benjamin Franklin. The lightning rod, protection from electrical storms, simple, elegant, rational. And for a single copper spike above a barn in rural Pennsylvania, I might accept that. But the deeper I went, the more the lightning explanations started to collapse. Because the structures we're talking about, the ornate metal rooftop features of major civic, academic and commercial buildings in the mid-19th century were not lightning rods in any meaningful sense. Lightning rods are grounded. They run wire from the tip of the spike down the side of the building into the earth, dissipating charge harmlessly into the ground. That is their entire function. But here's what I kept finding. In photograph after photograph, in architectural survey after architectural survey, many of these structures weren't grounded at all, or they were grounded in ways that don't match the function of simple lightning protection. They were connected to the buildings themselves, to internal metal frameworks, to elaborate internal networks of pipes and conduits that 19th century documentation attributes to, variously heating systems and ventilation, and, my personal favourite, decorative ironwork that connects to the roof and runs through the walls and terminates at fixtures in every major room. I want you to think about what that sounds like, not what we're told it is, what it actually sounds like to a person encountering it without the official label attached. It sounds like wiring. An architect named Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, the man responsible for restoring dozens of Gothic cathedrals across France in the latter half of the 19th century, including Notre Dame, wrote extensively about what he found inside these buildings. He described metal internal structures of uncertain purpose. He attributed them to medieval craftsmanship. He incorporated them into his restorations. But several of his contemporaries noted with some unease that Viollet-le-Duc seemed more interested in understanding these internal systems than in simply preserving them. Some of them, his critics noted, were removed during restoration. Why would you remove infrastructure from a building you're restoring? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In the United States, the period immediately following the Civil War, that is, the period immediately following the Carrington Event, saw the demolition or renovation of enormous numbers of civic buildings, not because they were damaged, not because they were structurally unsound, because they were, according to the documentation of the time, outdated, unsuited to modern use, in poor repair. But the photographs of these buildings, taken just years before their demolition, show structures that appear robust, ornate, and moire. Here's the part that keeps pulling at me. Architecturally far more sophisticated than what replaced them. The replacement buildings of the 1860s through 1880s are simpler, flatter, lower, fewer spires, fewer rods, fewer rooftop elements of any kind. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let me return to September 1st, 1859, because I think we've been handed a very clean story about a very strange event. Richard Carrington was, by all accounts, a serious and careful observer. His sketch of the solar flare he witnessed that morning is precise and detailed. His account of the event is measured and scientific. He was, by the standards of 1859, an impeccable witness, but Carrington himself was cautious about causation. He noted the correlation between his solar observation and the geomagnetic disturbance that followed, but he explicitly stated, and this is in his original paper to the Royal Astronomical Society, that one coincidence is not sufficient to establish a fact. He was uncertain, he was methodical, he was, frankly, more sceptical of his own conclusion than the history books that followed him. The certainty came later. The official framing, solar flare causes geomagnetic storm. Geomagnetic storm disrupts telegraphs. That story was assembled in the years and decades after the event. By the time the 20th century arrived, it was gospel. But there are things about the event itself that the official explanation doesn't address cleanly. The first is timing. Telegraph operators across North America and Europe reported that the disturbances began, in many cases, before the storm's expected arrival time based on Carrington's observation. Some accounts describe anomalous telegraph behaviour beginning hours earlier than solar physics should have permitted. The historical record on this is blurry, and I'll address why records are blurry in a moment, but the anomaly exists. The second is the nature of the disruption itself. Telegraph lines failed, yes, but they failed in ways that operators found deeply strange. Not in the way a power surge fails a circuit, not in the way a lightning strike destroys a wire. The lines didn't simply go dead, they went active. They surged with current of unknown origin. Operators who touched their equipment were thrown backward. And in multiple documented accounts, most famously between operators in Boston and Portland, Maine, messages continued to transmit autonomously without battery power for extended periods. The third is what wasn't disrupted. In 1859, there were other electrically conductive systems in operation beyond the telegraph. Gas pipelines in major cities, water supply infrastructure with extensive metal components, railroad networks with miles of metal rail. And, I keep coming back to this, all those spires, all those rods, all those metal rooftop elements on tens of thousands of buildings across the civilized world. What happened to them during the Carrington event? We don't know, because almost no one recorded it, and that's where the official explanation begins to break down. Think about the telegraph operators. They were a small, highly technical community. They understood electricity, or at least they understood their machines. When something impossible happened to those machines, they talked about it. They wrote about it. They sent reports to newspapers and scientific journals. Their accounts are in the historical record because they had the framework, the community, and the vocabulary to describe what they experienced. Now, think about a building owner in New York City in 1859, or a cathedral caretaker in Lyon, or a groundskeeper at a university in Edinburgh. If something happened to the metal infrastructure of the buildings around them during the Carrington event, if there was, say, an unexpected discharge, an unusual luminescence, a crackling or humming in the walls and towers, who would they report it to? In what framework would they understand it? With what vocabulary would they describe it? And here's the strangest part. We have almost none of those accounts for an event that reportedly lit the sky red from pole to pole, that sparked and electrified every metal wire on the continent, that represents, by the official account, the most powerful geomagnetic storm in recorded history. The documentary record is astonishingly thin on first-person accounts of anything other than telegraph disruption and aurora sightings. The silence was deafening. I want to be careful here. I'm not making a definitive claim about what these buildings were. I'm asking questions about what they may have been. Because when you look at the architecture of the early to mid-19th century, and I mean really look at it, not as a student of aesthetics, but as someone asking functional questions, certain patterns become impossible to ignore. Public buildings of the early 1800s in virtually every culture that produced monumental architecture share a suite of features that are conventionally explained as decorative or symbolic. Tall central spires, copper or metal-tipped finials, elaborate roof structures that maximize the building's vertical profile, high ceilings with metal chandeliers hanging from elaborate ceiling fixtures, walls with internal metal conduit, floors in many cases with elaborate geometric tiling that incorporated conductive materials, and the orientation. God, the orientation. The major civic and ecclesiastical buildings of the pre-1860 world are not randomly oriented. They are oriented with what appears, in retrospect, to be extraordinary precision. North-south and east-west alignments that go beyond the requirements of liturgical tradition or urban planning. The great cathedrals of Europe, the grand civic halls of American cities, even the layout of urban grids in cities established in the early 19th century show an organizing logic that doesn't reduce simply to convenience or tradition. What would it mean if buildings were oriented to optimize something, some field, some current, some relationship to the electromagnetic properties of the Earth itself? I'm not saying they were. I'm asking, what if they were? Because there is a body of 19th century scientific writing, not fringe writing, legitimate scientific writing, published in legitimate scientific journals that take seriously the idea of atmospheric electricity as a potentially harvestable energy source. Nikola Tesla famously spent the latter years of his career attempting to access what he called the wheelwork of nature, a world-spanning electrical system embedded in the relationship between the ionosphere and the Earth's surface. His Wardenclyffe Tower, begun in 1901 and never completed, was designed to tap into this system. But Tesla wasn't inventing this idea from scratch. He was, by his own account, developing something that he believed had been understood before, something that had been lost. What was it exactly that Tesla believed had been lost? The deeper I went into Tesla's published writings and interviews, the more a recurring theme emerged. He spoke about energy systems in nature. He spoke about resonance. He spoke, in particular, about the way that tall conductive structures, properly designed, properly positioned, might interact with the charged layers of the atmosphere to produce a continuous electrical current. He called this a discovery, but there are moments in his notebooks, in his late interviews, in his correspondence, where he seems to catch himself, where the word rediscovery appears to hover just behind his actual words. What if the spires weren't decorative? What if the finials weren't symbolic? What if the orientation wasn't liturgical? What if, before September 1859, there was a world-spanning network of structures built over centuries, possibly over millennia, in the same way that the same Gothic structural logic appears in cathedrals from Santiago de Compostela to Cologne to Canterbury, without any central architectural authority to explain the coordination? What if that network was doing something functional, something energetic? And what if the Carrington Event destroyed it? This is the part that I keep returning to. This is the thing I can't explain away. The worldwide coordination problem. If you wanted to build an energy harvesting network using atmospheric electricity, and let's assume purely hypothetically that such a thing were possible, what would it look like? It would look like a network of tall conductive structures spaced at regular intervals, built to precise heights and orientations, connected internally to the buildings and communities they served. It would look, in other words, like what existed, not in one city, not in one country, not in one cultural tradition, in Paris and in Peking, in London and in Lima, in Moscow and in Mumbai, in Cairo and in Constantinople, in Boston and in Buenos Aires. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Now, the conventional explanation for this worldwide architectural similarity is cultural diffusion, trade routes, colonial influence, the spread of European architectural styles through imperial expansion. And I don't dismiss that entirely. It explains some of the similarity in some regions during some periods, but it doesn't explain why pre-contact civilizations in the Americas built tall, precisely oriented stone structures with metal elements at their peaks. It doesn't explain why ancient temples in Southeast Asia follow the same basic vertical logic as Gothic cathedrals built a hemisphere away. It doesn't explain why the sacred architecture of cultures that had no documented contact with each other kept arriving at the same solution. Tall, metal-tipped, carefully oriented vertical structures connected to something above and something below. What were they all trying to reach? And here's the coordination problem in its sharpest form. If these structures were purely decorative or purely symbolic, why the metal? Why the conductive material at the apex, always at the apex in culture after culture, century after century? Stone is cheaper, wood is easier. The deliberate choice of metal badge, copper, bronze, iron, gold for the highest point of the highest structure in any given community requires an explanation. Symbolism alone doesn't build a supply chain for copper finials. Function does. Something happened after 1859, something in the physical landscape of civilization. I've spent an uncomfortable number of hours looking at before and after photographs of major world cities from the 1850s to the 1880s. daguerreotypes from the early 1850s showing elaborate skylines, spires, towers, rooftop structures of extraordinary complexity. Photographs from the 1870s and 1880s showing the same cities with those elements systematically reduced, simplified, removed. The demolitions were not framed as demolitions, they were framed as improvements, progress, urban renewal. The language of that era is relentlessly optimistic about what was replacing the old structures. But the documentation of why specific buildings were targeted, not the rhetoric but the actual reasoning, is almost universally vague. Outdated design, structural concerns, the exigencies of modern commerce, but no engineering reports, no detailed structural assessments, no documentation of what precisely was wrong with buildings that had in many cases stood for 50, 100, 200 years. The evidence suggests something much larger than routine urban renewal was underway. Consider what was happening simultaneously in the world of science. The post-1859 period is when the modern electromagnetic framework, Maxwell's equations formalized in 1865, Hertz's experimental confirmation of electromagnetic waves in the 1880s, the entire architecture of classical electromagnetism was being assembled and codified. This is when the official scientific story about how electricity works was being written. And in that same window, the physical infrastructure that didn't fit the official story was disappearing. Not why, not when, not under which administrative authority. No, how? How does a civilization simultaneously build a new theory of energy and remove the physical evidence of a different approach to energy? How does that happen with such consistency across such different political and cultural contexts without any central coordinating authority that history has preserved? Because if there was a central coordinating authority directing the removal of pre-1859 energy infrastructure across multiple continents, we would expect to find its records, its correspondence, its orders, its minutes. We don't find them. The silence was deafening. Here is what I can document, not speculate about. Document. In the decades immediately following the Carrington Event, the worldwide copper trade underwent a dramatic structural transformation. Copper production accelerated. Copper prices fluctuated in ways consistent with either a massive new demand for the metal, telegraph wires, the official explanation, or a massive reduction in demand as an existing use for copper was discontinued. The records are ambiguous in ways that seem, on reflection, almost deliberately ambiguous. The architectural training manuals and engineering textbooks published after 1860 show a notable simplification of recommended rooftop design. The elaborate finials and spire systems that appear in pre-1860 architectural literature are, in the post-1860 literature, quietly de-emphasized, not argued against, not debunked, just not mentioned, as if they had never been a subject of serious architectural consideration. There are testimonials from this period, scattered anecdotal but consistent, of craftsmen and builders who reported that specific rooftop elements were being removed from still-standing buildings by order of city authorities or building owners without any recorded reason. A stonemason's diary from Edinburgh, dated approximately 1864, describes the removal of copper fixtures from a large civic building, noting with evident puzzlement that the work seemed pointless, since the building was otherwise in good repair. He doesn't explain it, he simply records his confusion. His confusion is the record. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want to revisit something that I think has been hiding in plain sight for 160 years. The Carrington Event's official narrative centres almost entirely on the telegraph, the disrupted telegraph lines, the shocked telegraph operators, the autonomous telegraph messages. The telegraph is the protagonist of the official story. But why? Think about it from the perspective of a historian trying to reconstruct what happened on September 1st to 2nd, 1859. What sources do you have? You have newspaper accounts which focused overwhelmingly on the aurora, because the aurora was spectacular and universal and anyone could see it. And you have telegraph operator accounts because telegraph operators were connected to each other, they were a professional community, and when something strange happened to their machines, they reported it to each other and to management. What you don't have, or what you have almost nothing of, is a systematic accounting of what happened to every other conductive system on the planet during those hours, because there was no systematic accounting. Because there was no professional community of atmospheric energy infrastructure operators to report anomalies to their management, or was there? The deeper I went into the architectural and engineering records of the pre-1859 period, the more I found references, scattered professional matter-of-fact references to the maintenance and operation of building systems that sound, in retrospect, nothing like what we're told they were. Maintenance logs from large European institutions describe regular inspection of atmospheric conductors and roof charge systems in language that doesn't quite match simple lightning protection. University records from several American institutions describe dedicated staff positions, caretakers, essentially, responsible for the monitoring and maintenance of rooftop systems whose function is never clearly specified in surviving documentation. Were these the operators of something else? And here's the strangest part. After the Carrington event, these job titles disappear from institutional records, not abruptly. Gradually, over the following decade, the maintenance role for these unnamed rooftop systems simply ceases to appear in the records. The positions aren't eliminated with fanfare. They aren't replaced with something else. They just stop. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Not a scandal, not a budget cut, not a reorganization, just silence. I want to be honest about the limits of what I'm doing here. I can't prove that there was a world-spanning energy network built into the architecture of the pre-1859 world. I can't prove that the Carrington event destroyed it or disrupted it or revealed it in some way that prompted its systematic removal. I can't prove that the official story about solar physics and geomagnetic storms was constructed to cover something that the event actually revealed. What I can do is point to the shape of the whole. Every system leaves a trace when it disappears. The trace isn't always the system itself, it's the absence, the discontinuity, the place where something was and then wasn't, the architectural scars where rooftop elements were removed, the job titles that vanish from institutional records, the engineering literature that quietly stops discussing practices it once treated as standard. The maintenance logs that describe, in language we don't quite have a framework for, the operation of systems we don't quite have a name for. This raises a simple but critical question. Who decided what should be remembered? History is written by people who survive, yes, but it's also curated actively, deliberately over generations by people who decide what goes in the archive and what doesn't, what gets indexed and what gets lost in a basement, what gets digitized and what remains in a box no one opens. The pre-1859 architectural record is extraordinarily rich in some ways. There are daguerreotypes of extraordinary clarity showing the built world of the 1840s and 1850s in remarkable detail. And yet the functional documentation, the maintenance manuals, the operational records, the what is this and how does it work records, for the infrastructure those photographs show is strangely thin or strangely absent. The evidence suggests something much larger than simple historical attrition at work. There are buildings that survived, buildings where the original rooftop elements remain, not as functional systems, presumably, but as architectural relics. If you know what to look for, you can still find them in older neighborhoods of European cities, in the occasional surviving civic building in the American Midwest, in isolated institutional buildings on old university campuses. And when I look at them, when I really look at them, standing on the street below and tracing the logic of the metal, the placement of the finials, the way the vertical elements are spaced and oriented, I keep having the same experience. I keep having the experience of looking at something that was designed, not decorated, designed, engineered, built with a specific functional intention that went beyond aesthetics and beyond simple lightning protection and into something I don't have clean language for, something that was supposed to do something, something that may have been doing something for years or decades or centuries in cities all over the world before September 1859. The Carrington Event remains the most powerful geomagnetic storm in recorded history. Scientists today estimate that an equivalent event striking the modern world would cause trillions of dollars in damage to electrical infrastructure, satellites disrupted, power grids down, communications crippled. We are told this would be a catastrophe. But here's what I find myself thinking about. What if, for a civilization with a different relationship to electrical infrastructure, a civilization whose energy systems were distributed and atmospheric rather than centralized and grid-based, what if such an event would have been something different? Not a catastrophe. A disruption, yes. A reset, perhaps. But not the civilization-ending event it would be for us unless the systems were damaged, unless the Carrington Event didn't just pass through the atmospheric energy infrastructure of 1859 like a wave through water, but broke something, overloaded something, discharged capacities that took decades or centuries to build. What would that look like? It might look exactly like what we see in the historical record after 1859. A civilization that, in the space of a single generation, appears to completely abandon an architectural and engineering tradition that had persisted across cultures and centuries. A civilization that replaces that tradition with something new, the centralized electrical grid, the coal and gas utility, the privatized and metered energy system, with remarkable speed and very little recorded debate about what was being left behind. Not debate, not mourning, not even acknowledgement, as if the thing being left behind couldn't be talked about, as if the framework for discussing it had also, somehow, disappeared. The silence was deafening. I began this investigation thinking I was looking at a curious historical anomaly, a strange solar event, an interesting chapter in the history of telecommunications, something to satisfy a passing curiosity and move on from. I'm not moving on from it, because the deeper I went, the more clearly I could see the shape of the thing I couldn't quite see. The outline of a world that operated on different principles than the world we've inherited. A world where the architecture wasn't just shelter and symbol but function, where the buildings themselves were part of an energy relationship with the planet and the sky. A world that may have understood something about the electromagnetic nature of reality that we are only now beginning to rediscover in fragments at the edges of acceptable science. And then, one September morning, the sky went red. And when it cleared, something was gone. Not destroyed in a war, not abandoned in a collapse, not lost in a fire or a flood or the fall of an empire, gone more quietly than that. Gone in the way that things disappear when the people who understand them disappear first. Gone in the way that knowledge disappears when the framework for transmitting it breaks down. Gone in the way that infrastructure disappears when no one is left who knows what it was for, or gone in the way that things disappear when someone decides they should. I'm not going to tell you which of those it was. I'm not sure I know. I'm not sure anyone knows, or if anyone does, they're not the kind of person who talks to documentary filmmakers. What I will tell you is this. The official explanation for the Carrington Event is coherent, well documented, and scientifically reasonable. Richard Carrington saw a solar flare. A geomagnetic storm followed. Telegraph systems were disrupted. The world went back to normal. But what if normal after September 1859 was something different than normal before it? What if the world that went back to normal wasn't quite the same world? What if something in the architecture of civilization, something literally built into the buildings we lived in, the spires we raised toward the sky, the copper rods we placed at the highest point of every structure we considered important, what if something in all of that simply stopped working? After a morning in September, after the sky turned red and the telegraph lines sparked and the aurora burned at the equator? What if we've been living ever since in the ruins of a power grid we don't remember having? These structures still stand in the places that survived the renovations. You can still look up at them. You can still trace the logic of the metal, the placement of the finials, the way the spires reach toward whatever it was they were always reaching toward. The sky hasn't changed. The atmosphere still holds its charge. And somewhere in a maintenance log that no one has indexed, in a job title that disappeared from the records sometime in the 1860s, in the cautious language of a stonemason in Edinburgh who noted with puzzlement that he was removing copper fixtures from a building that didn't need fixing, somewhere in all of that is an answer to a question we've forgotten how to ask.